we are masquerading this idea of, well, we're not able to be generous yet, but we will be one day. All we're doing is lying to ourselves that we haven't recognized that we struggle with the idea that we don't have enough.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Purpose-Filled Money Podcast. We're your hosts, Courtney and Caleb Sams. And if you haven't gone back and listened to the first few episodes, do so. They are foundational episodes that's going to kind of help set the stage for the rest of this conversation moving forward. We've looked at that there's a tension. It creates these gaps. The Bible is the bridge that we're going to use to cover those gaps. And so we're not going to hold faith and finances in both hands anymore. We're going to have a conversation of how to bring those two things together. And so today, what we're going to talk about are spiritual practices and what they're used for, why they're important, and for the purposes of our conversation, why generosity is one of them. So yeah, I'm going to kick it off with asking a question, Caleb, of why do we even have spiritual practices? Why are they an important part of our life?
Yeah, I might be the only person here doing this, but I can't. I mentioned it earlier as we were walking through. I just hear this siren going off my head. And I got Allen Iverson sitting at a press conference table. Just go, we're talking about practice, not the game. Practice. There's probably nobody else listening. You don't even know what I'm talking about right now.
I have no idea.
One of the most famous press conferences of all time. And it's not even resonating with you.
No, when you say you're the only person here, that's 100%. There might be.
One of our other 7 listeners will know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. The only one is if Graham is listening. He might know. That's it.
This is for you, Taft.
Taft might know.
I think so. So why are spiritual practices necessary? What are they for? What do they do? I find myself regularly when I'm interacting with clients equating finances to our own personal experiences with our interpersonal relationships, whether it be with spouses, family, parents, children. Whether it's our relationship and journey with our own personal health and fitness or dieting, and on our grander scale, I think we could find that same experience within our journey with our faith. I think we've said this on almost every episode so far, and maybe that's why these are fundamental. I think if you're here listening to us and you're interested in this conversation, and you're trying to figure out how to bridge the gap between faith and finances, and you are not one of our moms, the reason you may be here is because you have regularly found yourself in a state at loss of, how did I get here? That we go through these peaks and valleys and moments where everything's in alignment, and we are, whether it's with our money, we're budgeting well, and we're watching our spending, and we're saving the way we want to save, and we're giving how we'd like to give, and everything feels like it's moving in the right direction, and we're proud of that. And we've, for a period of time, we've put away the anxiety or the shame of our use of money. And then over time, something happens, or rather something doesn't happen. And we wake up a year later or 18 months later and we go, it's been a couple months since I've made a payment on that credit card. And I don't know the last time I opened up my budgeting app or looked at our expenses or even figured out how much was coming in compared to how much was going out. And I talk to people all the time that regularly go, just a year ago I had this in savings and now I've got this in debt. And I think in all those ways, whether it's our finances or if it's our relationships or our faith or our fitness and our goals and all those spaces, that the common lived human experience is this cyclical wandering through life of moments of focus and intention and purpose, and then moments of apathy or wandering or downright abandonment of those things. And I think the reason practice becomes important and why we're talking about practice is our job is not perfection. Our goal is not to do everything right every time. But in those spaces in our lives, and in the context of this conversation, specifically maybe with our finances, we are seeking to figure out what does it take to extend the periods where our focus is high, where our intention is good, and we're living purpose-filled lives with our money, and to shorten the periods where we've lost that focus, to learn, like we talked about in the episode with the bridge, to learn to recognize the flags and the signs that God is putting in our lives as we start to kind of drift off in the direction that Satan is pulling us, like we talked about in the tension, that we would start to build these practices. I mean, just the idea of practice in general is that over time you get better at something. Mm-hmm. That you build on a certain set of skills, and you take those skills into the world with you, and then you kind of learn where you're at with those skills, and you go back to the lab and you practice some more, and you come out with some new skills, but they're built off of the previous set of skills. And so the goal being that we're, again, probably never achieving perfection, but that we're working out the muscle of what does it look like to master our finances for the purposes of the kingdom, instead of allowing the finances in our lives to be our master.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think something that is just so neat, so encouraging, that I think is when, like, as we're learning about rabbi and disciple relationships, is we're not left to just kind of go like, okay, well, what do we do? Like, we have no idea. You call these things spiritual practices like prayer and reading, and we have no idea. And it's just like, no, we had the ultimate teacher. Jesus modeled everything for us that we could possibly do here on earth. And we do as he did. And then on top of that, you see it modeled where you have other disciples making disciples. And so you have these people that have probably gone a few steps ahead of you, just one step ahead of you, doing things as Jesus did to the best of their abilities. And that you're seeing that, like, I really think that you're doing things in light of what scripture say, and then you model after them. So it's this idea of, like, we're not left alone, and you're not left to try to kind of like figure it all out on your own. We're all practicing together, and we're all growing together. And I just think that's such a cool part of this community that God's created. Yeah.
And to what end? Like, to what's the reason behind it all, right? Like, if you're here joining us in this conversation because you're just looking for, well, what am I supposed to invest in? How much am I supposed to save? What is it supposed to, like, I think as someone who has built their career around answering that question to some degree, you're in the wrong place. I think our ultimate motivation behind this conversation is we want to look more like our God. We want to look more like our King. We want to look more like our Creator. And at the root of this idea of the practice is, the purpose behind it is, when I do these things, and as I get better at them, and as I mold them into my life, and they become more reflexive and more habitual and more a part of the character of who I am, and not the thing that I do every once in a while when I'm confronted with it. But as I seek to expand these things in my life, they make me look more like Jesus. They make me start to look more like my rabbi, which is the ultimate goal of a disciple. Mm-hmm. And I think the 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 point of this conversation, I think, is to maybe ask our listeners, have we ever considered that generosity is as much a spiritual practice as some things that might come easier to our mind of prayer and scripture reading and trying to spend time in isolation or in nature to serve, things that I think if we asked a poll, a room and said, what are some of the main spiritual practices that you do in your life?
What's the game show with Steve Harvey?
Yeah, Family Feud.
Yeah, if we family feuded the spiritual practices.
If we asked your 100 average everyday Christians,
it would be prayer, reading.
Yeah.
Probably fasting, even though I don't think that people regularly do that.
Yeah.
They might say like solitude.
Yeah.
And one that it might not show up there, but I wish that we did more, would be Sabbath.
Yeah.
But anyway, sorry, that was a random side note.
But it's likely that maybe generosity doesn't even make the list.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because I think Scripture points a different viewpoint on generosity, and I'm excited as we get to dive deeper into this conversation and spend some more time in the text in more focused ways in future podcasts to really dig into that. But I think something we could all agree on is that we serve a generous God.
Yeah. Yeah. And something that just dawned on me. And I don't know, it would be interesting to kind of explore this light. But if generosity, which I think it is, like I do think that it is a spiritual practice, just like prayer, just like scripture reading, just like all of those things, that if that is a practice in your life, and that's kind of your, I call it like a North Star, a lot of your other financial stuff will fall in line around it. Like you cannot be generous without being stewardly. You cannot be generous without budgeting. You can't be generous without thinking about the future. You can't be generous without thinking about today.
Yeah.
Like I think it's a spiritual practice that Jesus modeled. It's one that God certainly modeled over and over again.
Yeah. There's probably you not that that's the point of this podcast, but maybe it'll drive home the level of importance of this idea. You probably, if we tease that thought out more, you're not going to spend significant amounts of time in your day-to-day life in Scripture without intention and purpose and buffeting your schedule well and committing to, even when it's not easy or when you're tired. You're not going to have a consistent active prayer life without committing to an intentional purpose of, we're going to pray this way, this often. Like you're definitely in the handful of times we've attempted to Sabbath. You're not going to do that. They said that the Friday night before sundown was the busiest time in the entire city of Jerusalem, because you're not going to do that without some purpose behind it.
Yeah.
You try to set your life down for 12 hours, 24 hours. And I think maybe the overarching theme here with the idea of spiritual practices is you are not going to accidentally walk into this.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to wake up tomorrow and be the type of generous person that you desire to be.
Yeah.
You're not going to wake up tomorrow and have any of these spiritual, at their extreme, you're not going to have any of these spiritual disciplines when they become that part of your character.
Yeah.
She's going to cut eyes at me because I said at the beginning, I said, let's not mix up spiritual disciplines and practices. Let's stick with the title of the episode of the practice. But maybe you practice to again, not perfection, but there's probably a point in our lives where our practice is paid off to some degree of, this is now a part of who I am. And I still have room to grow and get better, and I'll still maybe have some of my own cycles and peaks and valleys, but none of this is happening by accident.
Yeah. And the thing that we had talked about this earlier in preparing for this episode, something that you had listened to probably on a random TikTok, something that I read somewhere, is just this idea
If you're wondering how we both interact with media.
Yeah. You read the subtitles. What am I trying to say? What was it?
Well, if it's the TikTok I'm thinking of that I showed you a couple years ago, it was this guy, I think he was preaching, talking about generosity, talking about how the most generous person he knows is also the wealthiest person that he knows. Mm-hmm. And that typically when he's walking younger Christians through that thought process and he says that to them, they go, well, yeah, of course he is. Like, when I'm as wealthy as that, or when I finally reach this point, I'm like, of course he's generous. It's easy for him to be generous.
He has everything.
And he always stops. And it was interesting in the TikTok, whatever, we should put it in the show notes if we can find it, right? That he goes, you wouldn't want this guy's life. Like, he, at every moment in time that I've known him, and he said something like for the last 15 or 20 years, whatever, he's had no less than at least 8 different people living in his house that are not blood relatives of him, that he's letting, different organizations come to his property and use it for free to advance their mission and raise funds, whatever. Like, I don't know the guy. It's a TikTok I saw. But then he changed the tone of the conversation back to the audience, who in this moment was me. And he goes, if you're not generous with the life that you have now, if you're not generous with your 2-bedroom apartment, mm-hmm. if you're not generous with your 15-year-old car, if you're not generous with your life that you have now, you're not going to be generous then.
Yeah. Yeah. And that led me to the thought of, this is something that if it's not with generosity, it might be with something else. But I think that a lot of times people might say, well, I'll be generous when? Like, yeah. I'll be generous when I have, like, when I get my next raise, or when I get this next job, whenever I get my next house, whenever I get. And it's always an outward, we're guilty of this. Yeah. We do this. Don't get me wrong. Like, I do think we have a million faults. I do think for the most part, and it probably has more to do with you and less to do with me. You're very generous with a lot of our stuff. Anybody can use our car, our house. I think we're generous in a lot of areas, maybe not in all of them. I'm going on a rabbit trail, but a lot of times what can happen is we think it has to be an ideal scenario, or we have to, like, we will plan a future of, we have these grand ideas and grand plans of when when the perfect storm hits, that's when the rain will fall.
Yeah. So we have this definition of, this is the ultimate get. Like, this is my vision of what generosity looks like in my life. And if it can't look like that, then oftentimes we walk away from any ability or any calling of generosity in our lives yet, because we have this vision of,
we just won't do it until
it's supposed to look like this. It doesn't look like that, so that's clearly not it. I'll keep working and going. And I think in our minds, as we walk through this thought process, I think we have good intentions of, man, if we could ever get there. But I think the problem with the idea of practice is I'm skipping practice. Mm-hmm. I'm not showing up on leg day. I'm not doing the heavy lifting. Mm-hmm. That I'm trying to create a life where I go, just you wait, Satan. 20 years from now, when I get to where I'm going,
Yeah, watch out.
I'm going to start doing some stuff in the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole time Satan's going, when you get over there, you're not going to have a clue how to do it.
Yeah.
You're not going to have an idea of what it even looks like.
You have none of those muscles built up.
And the reality of what we're actually doing in that moment is we are masquerading this idea of, well, we're not able to be generous yet, but we will be one day. All we're doing is lying to ourselves that we haven't recognized that we struggle with the idea that we don't have enough.
Mm-hmm.
That we live in this space where I'm not pleased yet. I'm not ready yet. I'm not able to. And it's all just lies thrown back at us in different directions that say, when am I gonna remember who my God is?
Yeah.
When am I gonna sit down and recognize? Doesn't mean that there's not work to be done. It doesn't mean that there's not growth to be had. It doesn't mean that there's not changes to work for and hope for the future. But if I want to look like Jesus, and I want to work that out, and I want to practice that in my life, putting off generosity and living in a space of like, well, when I get there, is just buying into the lie that Satan told in the garden.
Yeah. And it's also, you were talking about this earlier, it's not what has been modeled in Scripture. Everyone has been called, even the poor, to give something. And it's always, what did you say, like equitable, and it's always a fair thing. It's people that have more are charged to give more, but even someone that has virtually nothing is still required to participate in that practice.
Yeah, there's language in the Old Testament about even those in poverty being prepared to give a cold glass of water. That the burden of generosity, as Paul would write, and we read it in the previous episode, of that people were called to give, but not beyond their means.
Yeah.
And that, I think we'll spend a deeper episode diving into this, but like we see this play out in our efforts to increase generosity. I hear it all the time as people talk about the widow with her 2 mites. And they go, look, Jesus was watching all these people, and he saw all these people putting in large sums of money, and then this widow comes in and she puts 2 mites in this offering, and it's all she had to live on. And Jesus goes and he says, she's given more than anyone because she's given all that she's had. And I have heard us pull that story out to go, so make sure you're giving. And I think, and again, that text deserves its own conversation, but it's sandwiched between 2 moments where Jesus is going, the temple system is corrupt and crooked, and it's going to be torn down and replaced because it's not right. And what this conversation of a call to a generous life is not saying is, like, you will not find in Scripture a desire for the church to put a burden on its people to give in a way that robs them of the ability to provide for their families, that robs them of the ability to provide for their children, for their needs. And so, the generosity that's present in the kingdom has always been ethical and equitable.
Yeah.
But this is this pull back and forth where I think a lot of times one of the things we do when we start to talk about money in our faith context is we go, okay, God calls us to be generous, But that could be that could be our treasure, but it's also our time and our talents too. And I think sometimes we're really quick to try and pull up and go, it's not just money. It's also our ability to do things and to show up and to serve and to give of our time and to give of our energy and of our passion and of our skills, and all of that's true. But Scripture's abundantly clear. It's about your money too.
Yeah.
That not beyond your means, not in a place that harms you, but often in Scripture, throughout the book, we're going to be called to look at ourselves and rectify, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. That it's better to give than to receive. That we serve a God who walked through a field and saw this thing of value and sold everything that he had to purchase it, and that's the God we're called to be like. And so there is this push and pull, and it's a personal thing. But I think the biggest challenge in that process would be to not allow ourselves to fall into the trap of sometimes glossing it over and going, it's about this stuff too, and it's not just about that. And it's like, that's true, but it's about our money too.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess in summary of this, generosity is, it's a practice that you're modeling after Jesus and after God. Yeah. And it's one that everyone can participate in. It's an equal opportunity of the practice. Just anybody can do it.
You could potentially go bolder and say, not only can anyone do it, if you are here listening to this podcast with us and you are in your life saying, well, I want to look more like Jesus, and you are not practicing generosity, then you do not look like Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Like the realization of that is not a death sentence, but you're missing a part of the character of God. Mm-hmm. And the beautiful thing about practice is, and this is, I think, an important piece to this, is the expectation is not for you tomorrow to wake up and be the best giver at your church. The expectation is not for you to wake up and throw everything. It's practice. If I've never worked out a day in my life and I walk into the gym, I'm not about to squat 500 pounds. Mm-hmm. I mean, I might, but
okay.
So like anything, work through a plan. Figure out the next step. Take small steps in the right direction. Get those quick wins and victories and the moments where you can start to understand what it's like. There's something really, really cool about generosity that I think if we spent the time extrapolating all these other spiritual gifts, there's probably a nature of this in them too, and I think that's because that's what the heart of God is. But generosity is one of the spiritual practices, and again, you could probably make this argument for all of them, but I think it's really easy to do with generosity that the truth of it's better to give than receive. The joy that generosity creates. I met a guy one time who his whole life mission was for every dollar that he earned, he wanted to give away to. I don't know how that math works. Like, I don't know. I don't know if he'd really played that out to see what that meant. He was a comedian, and was, I think, had some ways that he could give without, but I asked him why. I said, why? Like, why is that your goal? And he goes, it's honestly, the answer's selfish. There's nothing in the world that makes me feel better. And I think that's a beautiful thing about like what it looks like to seek after God's heart and to do the things, to involve the things in our lives that are going to make us look more like Jesus. Or we serve a good God that promises us life and good life The question, though, is, are we doing the things that he did?
Hey everyone, this is Courtney. I just wanted to pop in here real quick and just let you know that in addition to working with households on finances, we also work with churches and congregations and offer stuff like seminars on topics like generosity, aging parents, and we'll work with parents on teaching kids about generosity and stuff like that. So if you're interested and if you want to talk more or learn more about what we do, our contact information will be in the show notes and you can reach out if you like. Enjoy the rest of the podcast. Yeah. And so something that we came across over this summer, we had some college kids over for Bible studies. And so we went through this book called Practicing the Way. And Caleb's going to grab it and
I've only got like 15 of them sitting over here on the bookshelf next to me.
yeah. So, so that book just talks about the essence of the book is learn what Jesus did, do what he did. And they have a section in that book on generosity.
Yeah. And like any book, you're going to have to take, you go into it with discernment. There's
Sure.
going to be some
Yes.
stuff you interact with, you do or don't agree with.
The author is not an inspired biblical author. And so he's a man.
He's a good guy.
Yes, he's a good guy. He's a man, but he's a human. And so who knows?
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
The point of that is it's a great book and it's a really good read and it comes with some supplemental stuff. And so if this is something that you're very interested in, what they have in the supplements is kind of this like 4 to 6 week, very intentional.
They're all 4.
It's 4 weeks.
So it's made up of that whole study. You've got it's Practicing the Way there's an 8-week study on the overall practice, but then they've broken each individual practice down into 4-week studies. So it's a really cool resource for sure. So they have one specifically built for generosity. I think that's an excellent resource. I think there's a number of books that we've interacted with or have seen that we'll put in the show notes. Just to rattle a few off, there's so many, but Randy Alcorn's done a ton of work in this space about managing God's money and the grace of giving and the treasure principle these are all books by him. A book that we're reading and working on that we listened to a podcast not too long ago called God and Money has proven to be a pretty good book. There's a bigger book that they worked off of that Courtney's reading, which is what was it called? So you're telling me I don't have to tithe, or I don't remember exactly what it was called. But it was a thesis paper that's a little heady.
Yeah.
Joy Giving by Cameron Doolittle, the More of Less by Joshua Becker. So we'll include some other resources that can help you maybe alongside this conversation if you're looking for what does it even look like to practice generosity. And I think we plan on, as we get beyond these fundamental episodes, to break into some of the next sessions, seasons, whatever they're called, with doing some deeper dives into some of these fundamentals alongside some other topics. And I think the practice of generosity is going to be one that we're going to come back to a lot. But we thought it would make for a good kind of ending to kind of toss a challenge to ourselves and to you, to help us maybe move in the right direction of just the start of practice. And if you go through the Practicing the Way study on generosity, it's actually the same thing they do within the first week. And it's just a challenge to be intentional, to take out $5, $10, $15 out of your bank account of cash, and sometime during the course of the next week to practice an act of kind of I lost the word.
Generosity.
Yes, generosity, but there's like a spontaneous. To practice an act of spontaneous generosity. So at some point during this week, whether it's buying the meal of the car behind you or handing it to someone that you know maybe needs it more or something. And again, the expectation here is not that you wake up and you're writing a check the size of your mortgage to hand it over to somebody else. That we know that we want to look more like Jesus, and we want to take steps in that direction. But it'd be really cool to know that all of us together are committing to that practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the alternate, like if you look in your bank account and you're just like, I've got nothing. This is not something I can participate in. The alternate to that, because again, like we said, everybody can be generous. It's not just, it's not for a specific class of people. Yeah. Is finding something inside of your home and giving it away to someone that you know could use it or needs it more, or selling it and then giving that money. And so you can participate whether you look in your bank account and you have $5 to give, and you can participate if you look in your bank account and you know there's not going to be anything there that you can pull out. So, yeah, that's our challenge for this week. So it's something that we are going to do, and something that we invite you into as well. And then something that I really liked that I think we did last episode is we're calling this a conversation. And so something that we can discuss in a small group with a trusted individual, with your partner, with whoever you want to discuss this with and continue the conversation with, do you have a good discussion question that you want to do?
I think it'd be something along the lines of like, do you have an intentional, active plan that leads to generosity in your life? What does it look like? I'm struck by, I think, one of the biggest disservices we've done in church. And I think it's all a part of this kind of this underground darkness movement that we talked about in the first episode, that Satan's been really calculated and intentional, that we do not talk about this stuff. And I think we've held on to a misinterpretation of don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. In that same conversation, Jesus says, let others see your good deeds so that they would glorify your Father in heaven. So I think if we took the don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing to mean be so secretive that you're confusing yourself, I think it would explain a lot of the reason why we have houses and churches and places filled with a lack of understanding of the generosity of God. A cool story I heard a couple days ago was between two friends at a church, and one friend called the other friend up and he goes, "How much are you, like, do you tithe?" And he goes, "Well, yeah." He goes, "How much?" He goes, "I'm not going to answer that question. That's private." He goes, "Oh, come on. We do the same thing. And I know that you're at about the same level in your career as I am. So I know how much I make, and we give 50%. And what I'm not saying on this podcast is that you have to give 50%. I'm not saying that if we follow this journey of what does it look like to fall into the practice of biblical generosity, that we might not come face to face with the understanding that it's more than we think it is. But the thing that I took from that initially was, what a beautiful conversation that dude was not expecting to have when he answered the phone. And so maybe that feels awkward to ask someone, or to have someone ask you, what's your plan? What are you doing to give intentionally? But we want to look more like Jesus. And I think to do that together, to show each other how, to encourage each other forward.
Yeah. Going all the way back to kind of the first statements that we had is that God gave us a community to begin with for this, to spur on good works and to encourage each other and to be disciples of each other whenever someone has a trait of Jesus that we want to model.
Yeah.
So
thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Come back next week. We're getting into the system, where we're going to talk a little bit about how our thoughts and our beliefs impact our behavior, which then in turn impacts others around us. And I think coming off of this conversation, it's going to be in a really good spot to kind of figure out what about the system's currently broken. I think for too long we have tried to follow the ways of the world with money and stamp a Christian lifestyle on it. And I think what Jesus is telling us is it looks totally different than that. So join us next week.
All right. We'll see y'all then. Bye.